fist hammered against the lined shack door hard enough to rattle the hinges, and Cole Barrow came up off his cot with his hand on his rifle before his mind had caught up to the sound. It was near midnight, the wind outside screaming down off White Pass like something with teeth, and no sane soul rode out in a blizzard like this one, unless the alternative was worse. He hauled the door open against the wind and found a woman collapsing into the gap, her shawl frozen stiff, her belly swollen huge beneath her coat, her face white and slick, with sweat despite the cold. She caught the doorframe with both hands and doubled over with a groan that had nothing to do with the storm. "Please," she managed, "the baby, it's coming." Cole had not touched a woman in 3 years, had not let himself think past the next fence post or the next storm front in all that time, and now fate had driven a laboring stranger straight to his door on the one night no rider for 40 miles could reach a doctor. He got an arm around her and hauled her inside, kicked the door shut against the wind, and felt his carefully rebuilt composure crack straight down the middle. "How far apart?" he asked, voice rough, already dragging his cot nearer the stove. "Close," she gasped it out between clenched teeth. "Very close. I've been riding since noon, my wagon threw a wheel 2 miles back, I walked the rest." "Alone in this?" There was no one else. She said it plainly, not asking for pity, only stating a fact she'd clearly had a long time to get used to. "I'm Naomi Reeve. I was trying to reach my aunt's place past the pass before the weather turned. I didn't reckon on the weather turning quite this fast." She did not tell him yet, in that first frantic scramble to get her settled near the stove, how the wagon wheel had cracked clean through on a frost-heaved rut 2 miles back, pitching her trunk and her provisions into a ditch already filling with snow, or how she had stood there in the howling dark with one hand braced against her belly and made the only choice left to her walk and keep walking, because sitting still in a broken wagon with a baby coming and no one for miles would have been its own kind of death sentence. She had counted lightning flashes of pain the whole 2 miles, had gone down twice in drifts deep enough to swallow her to the thigh, had gotten up both times because some old, stubborn certainty in her refused to let a mountain and a man's greed both finish what a hard winter had started. She had seen the shack's black shape against the snow like a mercy she barely dared believe in, and had spent the last of her strength crossing the yard to it, fists already numb before they ever struck the door. Cole Barrow. He got her onto the cot, propped with every blanket he owned, and built up the fire until the little shack blazed with heat, and all the while some cold, familiar dread was climbing up his spine, because he had done this before, in a house very like this one, on a night very like this one, and it had ended with a grave he still visited every spring when the snow finally let the ground go soft enough to dig. "You've delivered a baby before," Naomi said, reading something in his face even through her pain. "Once," his jaw worked. "It isn't a story I tell." "Then I'm sorry to make you live it twice." She managed something almost like a smile, gray with exhaustion, before another pain took her and bent her double, and Cole put every old ghost aside because there wasn't room in that small shack for both his grief and her need, and hers, tonight, mattered more. He knew enough, barely enough, from that other terrible night to know what to check for, what to boil, what linens to tear into strips. He worked through the pains with her, murmuring whatever steadying nonsense came to him, holding her hand through contractions that came harder and closer as the storm outside climbed toward its worst. "Why were you out alone?" he asked her between pains, needing something to hold onto besides fear. 8 months gone in weather like this. "My husband died in a rockslide 5 months back. Amos." She said the name carefully, an old wound handled with practiced hands. "His brother Silas holds the note on our claim, held it jointly with Amos, and now claims it's his outright, since a widow can't work land alone, and a baby coming makes me weaker still in his eyes, not stronger. He meant to have the county declare me unfit to hold the claim once the child came, and take guardianship of us both, land and baby. I wasn't going to sit still and let him. My aunt would take us in past the pass, where Silas has no claim on either of us. I only misjudged how much winter was left in this mountain. Cole's hands, wringing out a cloth in the firelight, went still with a fury he hadn't expected to feel on a stranger's behalf. A man doesn't get to own a widow because he's decided she's weak. Try telling Silas that. Naomi's laugh came out half a sob as another pain crested. He's a great believer in what a man's owed. He isn't owed you. Cole said it simply, the way he said everything, and found he meant it with a ferocity that surprised him, given he'd known this woman scarcely an hour. The night wore on in a haze of pain and fireglow and howling wind, and somewhere in the depths of it, between contractions, Naomi asked him the question he'd been dreading. "Your first time, what happened?" Cole was quiet long enough that she thought he wouldn't answer. Then, "My wife, Ellen, 3 winters back near this same time of year, in a cabin not much bigger than this one, 20 miles from the nearest doctor and a storm just like this one sitting on the pass. I did everything I knew how to do. It wasn't enough. I lost her, and I lost our son within the hour, and I have spent 3 years telling myself I'd never again let myself care about anyone enough for that particular kind of ruin to be possible." He looked at her, gray eyes very steady despite everything shaking beneath them. "I won't lie to you and say I'm not afraid of how this night could end, but I am not going to let fear be the reason it does." Naomi reached out, mid-contraction, and gripped his hand hard enough to hurt. "Then don't let go of me, Cole Barrow. Whatever happens tonight, don't let go." "I won't," he said, and meant it as a vow rather than a comfort. Naomi bore the hours that followed the way she had borne the walk through the storm, with a grim, unshowy determination that Cole found himself watching with something close to awe. Between the worst of the pains she talked, as though the sound of her own voice were another rope to hold onto, telling him about Amos in scattered, fond fragments. How he'd proposed to her over a dropped basket of eggs neither of them had bothered to pick up. How he'd built her a porch swing the first spring of their marriage, though neither of them had a spare hour to sit in it. How he died in a rockslide checking a line, no different than the one Cole rode every week of his own life, which was a coincidence that struck them both quiet for a moment before another pain rolled through and put an end to quiet altogether. "Tell me about her," Naomi gasped once, gripping his hand hard enough to whiten her knuckles. "Ellen, your wife. I don't want you carrying her alone in here tonight. Let her keep us both company instead of just haunting you." It cost him something to answer, but he found, oddly, that it cost him less than staying silent had cost him for 3 long years. She had a laugh you could hear clear to the barn, wanted 6 children, and would have filled this whole territory with Barrows given the chance. She used to say I worried too much for a man who owned so little worth worrying over. His throat tightened. She was wrong about that last part. Turned out I had plenty worth worrying over. I just didn't know it again until you knocked on that door. "I understand that better than you'd think," Naomi said, when the pain had ebbed enough to let her speak evenly again. "After Amos died, I told myself the same kind of foolishness, that I'd loved once, hard and true, and lost it, and a heart could only stand to be broken open that far one time in a life. I nearly didn't fight Silas at all in the early weeks. It would have been easier to let him have the land and go live small and safe under my aunt's roof, never risking another single thing again. It was this child." She pressed a hand to her belly, wincing as another pain gathered, "who wouldn't let me choose safe over right. I couldn't teach her to be brave by being a coward myself." "You're the least cowardly woman I believe I've ever met," Cole said, low. "And I include myself in that reckoning, given how long I hid out on this mountain rather than risk what you walked 2 miles through a blizzard for. Then we're a matched pair of fools who forgot how to be brave, and are relearning it together on the worst night either of us has had in years." Naomi's laugh cracked apart into a groan as the next pain seized her, but there was something lighter under it now, some old fear loosening its grip in the sharing of it, and Cole held her hand through the whole of it, no longer entirely certain where his own old grief ended, and this fierce, unexpected new hope began. The storm reached its worst as her labor did, the wind screaming so loud around the shack's corners that they had to shout to hear each other over it. Snow driving sideways past the shuttered window in a solid white wall. The whole small structure groaning under gusts that Cole privately feared might peel the roof back before dawn. The fire guttered once, dangerously low, and Cole had to leave her side just long enough to feed it back to life, every second away from her, an agony he hadn't expected a stranger's pain to cost him. When he came back to her, she caught his sleeve and would not let go again, and he understood, without either of them saying it, that some line between stranger and something else entirely had been crossed somewhere in that hour, storm or no storm. "Something's wrong," Naomi gasped, near what he prayed was the end of it. "It isn't coming the way it should. I can feel it isn't right." Cole's blood went to ice water. He had seen this before, in another cabin on another night, and it had ended in a grave. But he made himself breathe, made himself remember every fragment of instruction the doctor had shouted at him 3 years back before it was too late to matter, and he worked his hand carefully, gently, the way that long-ago doctor had shown him once on a birthing model of leather and sawdust in a town clinic he'd visited afterward, determined never again to be so helpless. A small mercy of foresight from a grieving man that he had never expected to need. And that now might be the only thing standing between Naomi and the same fate that had taken Ellen. "The cord," he said, low and steady despite the roar in his own ears. "It's around the shoulder. I need you to push when I say, and not before, however much your body tells you otherwise. Can you do that for me, Naomi?" Yes, her voice broke on it, but her eyes held his, fierce and trusting in a way that undid something locked tight in his chest. "Yes, tell me when." He worked with a care that felt like carrying a lit lamp across a floor strewn with glass, easing the cord free with fingers gone slick and steady both at once. And when he finally said, "Now," she bore down with a cry that tore through the shack louder than the storm outside, and the baby came free into his waiting hands in a rush of blood and heat and silence. Terrible, endless silence. Cole's whole world narrowed to that small, still, blue-tinged shape in his hands, and for one unbearable second, he was back in that other cabin 3 years gone, holding a stillness he had never forgiven himself for. He cleared the tiny mouth with his finger, rubbed the small back hard with a cloth, willing every ounce of the fear in his chest into his hands instead, and when nothing happened, he did the only other thing he knew, learned from that same long-ago doctor. He turned the baby, firm and quick, and struck the small back once, twice. The baby coughed, sputtered, and let out a thin, furious wail that was the finest sound Cole Barrow had heard in 3 years of careful, deliberate silence. "A girl," he said, voice cracking entirely apart now that the danger had passed. "You've a daughter, Naomi. She's hollering fit to wake the whole mountain." Naomi wept and laughed at once, reaching for the baby the moment Cole had her wrapped and warm, and Cole knelt there beside the cot in a shack lit only by firelight and framed by a storm still howling outside, and let himself feel, for the first time in 3 years, something other than the careful management of grief. He felt joy, raw and unguarded, at a stranger's daughter drawing breath in his two hands. "Thank you," Naomi said, when she could speak again, cradling her daughter against her chest. "I don't have words enough for what you just did." "You did the hard part." Cole's voice was rough. "I only remembered what another good man once showed me on the worst night of my life, so it wouldn't be wasted on the next one. Seems like it wasn't." The storm raged another full day before it broke, trapping them together in the small shack with no way to send word anywhere. And in that stretched, snowbound time, something took root between them that neither could rightly call convenient anymore. Cole tended the fire and boiled broth and held the baby, whom Naomi named Ellen, without asking, watching his face carefully as she said it, and finding in his stricken, grateful silence all the answer she needed. While Naomi slept in fits and woke to find him watching over both of them with a devotion that had nothing left in it of the guarded, silent man who'd opened that door 3 days before. "You don't have to feel obliged to us," Naomi told him, on the second morning, watching him rock little Ellen by the stove with a tenderness that looked entirely unpracticed and entirely natural at once. "I know what this night cost you to live through again. I won't hold you to anything more than the kindness you've already shown. I'm not doing this out of obligation." Cole didn't look up from the baby's small, sleeping face. "I've spent 3 years making sure I'd never again care enough about anybody to be afraid for them. I made it 2 days back one look at your face in that doorway. I'm not fool enough to call that obligation. I'd call it the first honest thing I've felt since I buried my wife." Naomi's eyes filled, and she said nothing for a long moment, only watched him with the baby, this gruff, careful line rider who had pulled her daughter into the world with his own 2 hands, and now held her like something precious rather than something owed. That third snowbound day, with the wind finally dropping to something more like an ordinary mountain wind than a living fury, Cole took an empty supply crate from the shack's corner and spent the better part of an afternoon planing its rough edges smooth and lining it with the softest blanket he owned, until it made a passable cradle by the stove. Naomi watched him work with the small, absorbed concentration of a man who had clearly once built things for a life he'd expected to keep. And when he set the baby down in it for the first time, and she did not wake, only sighed and curled tighter into the blanket's warmth, something passed between the two of them that needed no further words. "You're good with her," Naomi said, watching him hover a moment longer than the task required. "Had a lot of years of not letting myself be good at anything that mattered." Cole straightened, a little embarrassed at being caught in the tenderness of it. "Seems it comes back easier than I expected, given half a chance." "What was your son's name?" she asked gently, when the quiet between them had settled enough to bear it. "You never said." "Daniel," he said it steady, though his eyes were bright in the firelight. "I don't often say it aloud. Feels good to tonight, for some reason I can't rightly explain." "Because you're not carrying him alone in a locked room anymore," Naomi said simply. "Grief's lighter shared, even second-hand. I learned that with Amos. I expect you're learning it now." He did not answer that in words, only reached over and took her hand, roughened and chapped from the storm and the walk that had nearly cost her everything, and held it a long while by the firelight, while outside the wind finally, truly began to die. The trouble came, as trouble does, the moment the weather cleared enough for word to travel. Silas Reeve rode up to the line shack 4 days later with a county clerk's paper in his saddlebag and a lawyer's letter half-drafted in his head, expecting to find a weakened widow easy to bully into signing away her claim now that the baby had come and made her, in his estimation, easier prey rather than harder. What he found instead was Cole Barrow standing in the shack doorway, rifle broken open over one arm in a posture that was less threat than simple fact, and Naomi behind him, with the baby wrapped warm against her chest, and a look on her face that held none of the fear Silas had counted on. Beside them, having ridden out that same morning to check on his line rider after word of the storm reached the home ranch, sat Cole's employer, old Gideon Rourke, owner of the Circle R spread, a man Silas Reeve owed money to and could not afford to cross carelessly. Reeve. Rourke's voice carried the flat authority of a man used to being listened to in that county. Didn't expect to find you way out here. Something wrong with your own, heard that you're out riding another man's range. Silas's confidence flickered, just slightly, at the sight of him, but he pressed on regardless, still counting on the widow's exhaustion to carry the day. "Come to see my brother's widow signs over what's rightfully mine," he said, not bothering to dismount. "She's in no state to work that claim with a baby on her hip, and everyone in the county knows it." "She's in a fine state to do whatever she chooses," Cole said, mild as still water, which unsettled Silas considerably more than a shout would have. "And as it happens, she won't be working that claim alone at all. We're to be married soon as the circuit preacher makes it through the pass. Whatever paper you've got in that bag, you'll want to take it up with both of us from here on, not just a widow you figured would be too tired to fight you." Silas's mouth opened and shut twice before anything useful came out of it. "You don't even know this woman a week." "I've known her 3 days, and I know her considerably better than you know your own conscience, Reeve." Cole's voice stayed level, but there was iron under it now, plain as the rifle on his arm. "I watched her walk 2 miles through a blizzard in labor rather than let you bully her out of what's hers. I'd think hard before you try that trick again on a claim that's about to have my name on it right alongside hers." Silas looked between them, the rancher who'd clearly decided, in the space of a single storm, to plant himself between Naomi and every threat left in the world, and the widow who no longer looked the least bit easy to frighten, and found, in the end, that his nerve for the fight had gone the way of most bullies' nerve when the easy target stops being easy. He looked once more to Gideon Rourke, hoping for some ally there, but the old rancher only shook his head slowly, as though disappointed rather than surprised. "I'd let it go, Reeve," Rourke said. "A man who tries to steal a dead brother's land off a grieving widow with a newborn babe isn't a man this county will extend much more credit to in any sense of the word. I'd think on that, riding home." Silas rode off with his unsigned paper still folded in his saddlebag, muttering threats about lawyers that all 3 of them understood, correctly, would come to nothing without a weak woman alone to aim them at. He did not trouble the line shack again, and word reached them within the month, through Rourke's ranch hands, that Silas had quietly let the matter drop rather than test how thin the county's patience with him truly ran. They were married within the month, once the circuit preacher finally made it through White Pass, in a ceremony small enough to fit inside the very shack where their daughter for Cole never once, from that first blizzard night forward, called Ellen anything but his own, had drawn her first breath. Gideon Rourke stood as witness, gruffly proud in his good coat, and a handful of Circle R hands who'd come to think a great deal of the quiet line rider crowded the small yard outside, having ridden out with a wedding gift of a proper hand-built cradle to replace the packing crate, and a jug of something warm enough to keep the chill off a celebration held in the last hard days of winter. Naomi wore a borrowed dress and held her daughter through the whole brief ceremony, and Cole said his vows with a steadiness that surprised even himself, a man who'd sworn off ever risking that particular kind of loss again, now standing in the wreck of his own careful vow, glad down to his bones to have broken it. When the preacher pronounced them married, The assembled hands let out a cheer loud enough to send snow sliding off the shack's roof. And baby Ellen, startled awake, added her own thin, furious wail to the celebration, which struck her mother as entirely fitting, given how loudly she had announced herself into the world in the first place. "I used to think I'd built myself a life safe from ever grieving like that again," he told her, that first night as husband and wife, watching her rock their daughter to sleep by the very stove that had blazed through the worst night of both their lives. "Turns out safe just meant empty. I'd rather have this, all of it, the fear included, than another year of that particular kind of quiet." Naomi looked up at him, weary and radiant both at once, a widow who had walked through a blizzard rather than surrender to a bully, now settled at last into a home no one could take from her. "Then I'm glad your door was the one I found that night, Cole Barrow. Out of every shack on that mountain, I found the one man in it who knew exactly how to hold on and never let go." "I told you I wouldn't," he said, and crossed the small room to kiss her hair, and out beyond the shuttered window the mountain lay quiet and white and finally, blessedly still, holding nothing more dangerous now than an ordinary winter. Come spring, when the snow finally softened enough for travel, Cole took Naomi and their daughter down off the line camp to a proper cabin on the small acreage he'd quietly bought years before, and never had the heart to build on alone. And together, they raised its walls higher, planted a garden where Ellen's grave flowers had once been his only planting each year, and let a new kind of ordinary life take root where only grief had grown before. Naomi kept a porch swing there too, in memory of Amos's old habit of building things neither of them had time to sit in, and most evenings, when the chores were done and their daughter finally slept, she and Cole sat there together anyway, making time for it at last. Two people who had each once believed their capacity for that particular kind of joy had been buried for good, proven wrong by a storm, a stranger's knock, and a child who had come into the world refusing, from her very first breath, to let either of them stay lonely a moment longer.